In this episode, we're going to be talking about how I built this miter station. Let's get to it. To get started on this project, I went to my local steel yard and got some 1.5 by 1.5 square tubing. Here you can see me unloading it and getting ready for the project. The first step in building this is going to be laying out the steel. I start by getting the main pieces cut and laid them out. Laying out the steel and making sure it's square is an important step. As you can see, what I'm doing is measuring the diagonals and then adjusting them as I weld them with a ratchet strap. As you're welding steel, it usually contracts, and you want to start with the face joints first and then finish with the fillets, because the fillet welds are going to pull the steel in the most. Even doing this, the frame didn't end up being 100% square, but it was close enough for what I needed. Once I got the frame assembled, I began to work on the vertical uprights on this station. The most difficult part in this whole process was keeping all this steel square as I built everything together. You can see what I'm doing is cutting some stops that I can use as spacers in between each of the steel pieces. This will allow me to keep everything straight and keep the measurements that need to be in tolerance within tolerance. The most important tolerances on this project are the pieces of steel going vertical. These pieces of steel need to be the exact dimension required for the drawer slides. The method I'm using to cut the steel is a Milwaukee 5 3/8 metal cutting saw. Typically you'd want to do this with a metal chop saw, but since I didn't have one of those available, I had to create a jig out of a framing square to ensure I was getting straight cuts. Surprisingly, this worked out very well, and it was quite convenient and fairly quick. Using a framing square, I was able to square up most of the steel for this project. I used clamps to keep everything in place so that when I welded them, everything would remain straight. Using 3-inch flat stock, I was able to keep a ledge on the front of this shelf. That way the Festool systainers would sit properly on the shelf without sliding forward. Because this is such a long piece of steel, I held it up with some magnets and then used those clamps along the length to get everything straightened out. Over at the bench, we got started on a holster for some brown contractor paper. In our shop, we do automotive work, carpentry, woodworking, metalworking, and a whole host of other things. I wanted a way to protect the miter station top. That way, if we were setting something on the bench that wasn't related to the miter station, we would have some extra protection. While at the bench, I decided to weld up a handle so that I could pull the cart around. Once it was filled up, I figured it would be somewhere around 1,000 pounds. So I wanted a good way to transport the cart both inside and outside the garage. When I was fabricating this handle, I took 2 short pieces of tubing and notched them with a 1.5-inch hole saw. Once I got them notched, I laid them out and welded them up. Over at the miter station, I tacked up the handle and made sure it was secured. Before moving on to paint and final assembly, I wanted to mock up the drawers to make sure they would fit properly. Once everything was welded up, I touched up a few areas with some Bondo. That way everything would look perfect once it's painted. Obviously, nothing is going to be free of blemishes, but I wanted to focus on making the front of the miter station as clean and uniform as possible. Not only is this bench going to be used for cutting wood, but it will also be used as a workstation. So I wanted to add several different outlets and options for power tools to be able to attach. You can see here that I've mounted several boxes to the actual metal frame, and I'm going to be wiring in 6 outlets total. One junction box at the bottom of the saw will be used for the vacuum saw and compressor, and then the other 8 outlets will be available for other tools when needed. Here you can see I'm sheeting the top of the metal with plywood. I'm going to be putting plywood all around the edges, which will later be covered in its respective material. This should give the workbench plenty of structure, and it doesn't need to be as strong as typical Baltic birch since it has a metal frame underneath. The tabletop is going to be covered in HDPE for added durability, and then the backdrop on this miter station is going to be covered with wood planks to make the miter station more visually appealing. It will also add contrast, which will make it show up better on video. With a trim router, we're putting a 1/4 inch round over on the HDPE to ease the edge. On the front of the miter station, we're mocking up the drawer slides for the first time. I'm going to be using rivets to install these drawer slides, which I've never done before. The reason for doing this is to ensure that the drawer slides can slide smoothly without hitting a large screw head. Normally in wood this would not be an issue, but since I created this whole frame out of steel, I wanted something that would be quick and not pose a problem for the drawer slides. I wanted to get everything mocked up, that way I knew if my template worked before continuing on. I had some leftover lighting laying around that I wanted to use for the under part of the bench. The problem was these lights were 4 feet long, and the bracing that I designed in the top of the bench prevented the lights from fitting. I came up with an idea to trim the lights down so that they would fit in between the braces. This is the first time I had ever done this. In theory, this should work, but I have never trimmed any LED strips down before. So I got to work and tested one out. Once the first one worked, I repeated the process on all 4 LED strips. When I was done, I ended up with a light that was not only working, but was at the custom dimension that I needed. This was a cool experience. I know now in the future if I ever have to trim down any of these lights, it is possible. I painted the inside of the light cages to reduce glare and reflection. Getting the lights assembled, I began to mount them to the underside of the bench. Once that was finished, I dropped some plywood on the top and got that fastened. This plywood would be the shelf needed for the systainers on the top rack. As mentioned before, the shelf is barely larger than a typical Festool systainer, so it should hold them nicely. I used self-tapping screws to fasten the plywood to the metal frame. I also painted the underside of the shelf as well as the light to make sure that everything would be uniform. After verifying the light fitment, I moved to the front of the station to continue on the drawer slides. With a rivet gun, I'm installing the last row of drawer slides and making sure everything lines up nicely. Some of these holes weren't exactly precise, so I had to widen them out and make them work. The key to making sure all these drawers lined up was creating a template and using that template to drill all the holes on each of the metal frames. Using some dark laminate flooring, I begin to start on the backdrop. The proper way to install the laminate flooring is to put down a glue, let it dry for about an hour until it gets tacky, and then apply the flooring. I initially started with this approach, but to be honest, I didn't want to wait a whole hour from the first time I applied the glue. So I decided to use a Graco pin nailer and everything worked out great. I figured there wasn't going to be much load bearing on these pieces, and if I was going to install anything onto them, it would go through the laminate flooring into the plywood in the back, which would be sufficient to hold any anchors or shelves that I wanted to install. After getting the lights installed and the backdrop done, I was amazed at how everything turned out. Using my router, I cut a slot in the HDPE for my T-track. This would be used for my stop block on either side of the miter saw. I chose this design so I could retain full use of the workbench top while still being able to have repeatable cuts when necessary. One of the standout features on this miter station is the backdrop I designed in the back of this workstation. My goal was to sheet the back and then cover it in some sort of wood-like material so that in the future, if I ever needed to take photos for thumbnails or do any interviews, I would have a place in the garage that I could do that. Using OSB, I began to sheet the back of the metal structure using self-tapping screws like I did on the front. Once I was done with sheeting the back in OSB, I could move along to the sheet that I was going to cover the OSB with. I selected these pre-painted panels from my local hardware store. They're not perfect, but they're significantly cheaper than going with individual planks. The key to getting the most out of these sheets is all about the install. Every time I had a butt joint, I used my track saw to cut the ends off the sheets, that way they would line up nicely. Once that was done, I went around with caulk and paint and filled all the holes to try to make the transition seamless. It's definitely not perfect, but when it was all done, it didn't look half bad. I'm really glad I spent the extra time filling the nail holes because it really made a difference. The first and most obvious feature of this workstation is the ability to have the saw flush with the table. This allows support for long stock on both sides. We have about 4 feet on that side of the blade and about 7 feet on this side of the blade. We also have this stop block installed that can be used on either side. That way you can use a stop to get accurate measurements of lengths, whatever you're cutting. Another really important feature is the ability to have these systainers and drawer slides. That way we can access everything easily. Before we just had them stacked in the corner, and anytime you needed something on the bottom, it was kind of problematic because you had to unstack everything, so that's really nice. Also have an air compressor down here. This is really cool. It's actually a portable unit, but I have it wired in underneath there where the saw is, the vacuum for the saw. So that allows us to be able to plug directly into that if we do need air using a nail gun or stapler or something like that. We have some outlets up here, which is really nice if you're using a jigsaw or whatever, just plug right in. And then we have a roller here that allows you to put paper here. So if you're working on something, you want to prep paint or anything like that, all you got to do is roll this up, cut it when you're done, that kind of stuff. And then the main feature of the bench that you can't see is on the back, so we'll flip around and we'll take a look at that. If we come around to the side, you can see we have the power cord for this workstation here coiled up around this handle that I welded up. Just makes it easier to move since it is so heavy. And then if you look here on the side, this is about a 5-inch opening for plywood that can be stored horizontally, which is really nice because in a smaller shop, our space is limited, and this allows us to keep it out of the way, and then if we need it, we can just move this card away from the wall and access it. So in keeping with the theme of this build, I wanted to make the back side of this workstation backdrop. That way, anytime I needed to do any product shots, reviews, interviews, anything like that, I could move this around and be able to use it as kind of like a mobile backdrop. That way we could utilize this space not only for the front side, but even use the back side when necessary for very practical uses. Well, I don't know about you, but after watching that video, I realized how crazy of a build that was. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you go down below and please comment, subscribe, that'd be much appreciated. We'll see you in the next one. Adios.